Well, today is going to be a real treat. We have a things hidden discussion with someone who has been a leading light for helping people understand the Gospels in a new way, particularly his work in expanding and understanding the mimetic nature of human beings, and our anthropology has been quite effective through the years in his efforts in this task. He is the author of books like Violence Unveiled, Humanity at the Crossroad, and also his newest book, God's Gamble, which will be coming out on audiobook very soon. Thank you for coming, Gil Bailey.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
Yeah. Now you're the founder of the Cornerstone Forum. Could you tell people a little bit about what you do with the Cornerstone Forum?
Well, the Cornerstone Forum has evolved over the years, the last 20 years. But today, or for the last quite a few years, we have been trying to bring about the connection between the cultural crisis that's underway and the Christian Gospels, the Christian revelation, and the work of Rene Girard, who is who passed away in 2015. He was the chair of French culture and civilization at Stanford, and he did some really truly groundbreaking work on cultural anthropology. And so we sort of we work within that triangle of the crisis in the culture, the Christian contribution to how to get out of it, and what Rene Girard has taught us about the predicament that we're in.
Yeah, and I've been listening to some of your lectures on things like Moby Dick and all kinds of things. So your work is very expansive. When did you do? I was listening to some of your work on the Hebrew prophets and said, "Wow, this is radical stuff here."
Well, I go that goes way back. Yeah, that goes way back. Well, I graduated from law school in 1968, and I came to California on a lark. Fell in with a sort of leftist tone of the place, and one thing led to another. I founded the first ecology center, the second in the world as far as I'm concerned, but the second in California, and did that for a few years until I realized that I wasn't called to that, and I lost heart in the whole thing. I moved to the country and started reading. I tell people that I graduated from law school in '68. I didn't learn to read until I was 30. I had a huge appetite to understand more about the Western culture, which I felt was shaking under my feet. And I had taken it for granted. I grew up a Catholic and went to Catholic schools and all of that. But then when I stepped into the California scene, I realized that something had come loose.
Yeah.
I began to read, and one thing led to another. I had to support my habit, as they say. So I started a little organization with just me. I offered classes in one thing and another. The class, Dante and Shakespeare and Homer and Virgil and the Gospels and the Old Testament and this and that and Moby Dick and those sorts of things. And so that was giving me some grounding in what our culture is really all about. I was also doing things in the Old and New Testament. But then the story, which I have recounted many times, but I'll recount it for your audience. I was on the Berkeley campus one day, and I, of course, went to the bookstore, and there was a sale table which had a book on it entitled Violence and the Sacred. And it was by Rene Girard. Now, I'd never read anything by Rene Girard, but I had seen his name in footnotes of things I had been reading. And I picked that book up and I read it, looked at the dust jacket and so on. And so I bought it. It was on sale. And I brought it home and started reading it. And within the first 15 or 20 pages, I realized that this man had cracked the code. That his voice was a distinct voice. What he was saying was unique and very powerful. And so I finished that book and I started reading other books. And then this gets a little complicated. There's a very, the biblical world was caught up at the time in critical reading of the Bible and so on. And I got interested in that too. I just followed my nose. I was like a child, really. I just went from whatever fascinated me to something else. And I got involved in some biblical scholarship. And there was a group at the time quite famous in that area, which was it was headed by Bob Funk, who was exegete, biblical exegete, and they were basically deconstructing the New Testament, and with great glee and great sense of importance and so on. And I had met Bob and some of the other people at the conference too. And Bob knew I was interested in Gerard. And so one day out of the blue, he calls me up, and he wasn't interested in Gerard. Gerard was entirely too orthodox for Bob. So and by the way, Bob's passed away, God bless him. But anyway, he called me up that day, one day, and he said, Gil, we're having another conference here in Sonoma this time. And we have it arranged. We have a place and so on. But a few of these scholars have convinced Rene Girard to come up from Stanford to spend a day with them, talking about the implication of his work for biblical scholarship. And Bob says, I don't have room for this. Could we do it in your office? And I thought I'd been struck by lightning. At that time, I don't even know if I knew whether Gerard was alive or dead, whether he was in this country or in France. I can't remember it. All I know is that when he said, I couldn't believe it. So the next thing I know, I met Renee when he came to my office. Now I'm operating a little educational institution in a little country town, just talking to the locals and and next thing I know, the guy who I think, if you'd asked me at the time, who would you most like to meet? I probably would have said John Paul II, but Rene Girard would certainly have been my second choice. He came to my office, and I'll have to recount this scene for you because it was something to behold. I only wish it were on video. Renee gave an opening remarks at 45 minutes or so. And you could tell by what he was saying that the ones who were less familiar with his work, and most were not terribly familiar with it, they were just rocked back on their chairs. It was like, and so the hands shot up, and one of them said, rather timidly, he said, Professor Gerard, it almost seems as though you're saying that in terms of its revelatory power, the gospel is superior to all other literature. But you're a Stanford professor. You're not saying that, are you? And Renee said, categorically. And it was like a bomb had gone on. Well, then we spent the rest of the day in conversation, which was extremely rich and illuminating. At the end of the day, the question, because there's a very apocalyptic feature to Gerard's work.
Right.
I mean, if you really once you've been encountered the gospel,
right,
if you succeed in completely eliminating it, you're in an objectively apocalyptic situation.
Yeah.
So he's very strong on that. So at the end of the day, another timid hand came up and he said, what you've been saying here is really kind of staggering. So what are we going to do about it? And so we Americans, we want to fix it. And he said, well, he was very, very humble guy. I could almost mimic him. That's because I'm mimetic just like everybody else. And he said, well, I don't know. We each are called to different things. But maybe we ought to begin with personal sanctity.
Mm-hmm.
You could have heard a pin drop. Afterwards, I said, you said the S word right there in front of those biblical scholars. So anyway, that was my introduction to Rene Girard. And my great good fortune was that over the next number of years, I went down to Stanford every month for a seminar with Renee and maybe 3 or 4 or 5 other people, where we explored the implication of this work. And it was just the richest experience. And I became a close friend with him and visited him. And we sometimes traveled together. And it was just a wonderful friendship. And
What were what was a favorite memory that comes to mind from your travels and adventures together?
Oh, there are many. Well, one was, it just comes to mind. I used to go down and have lunch with him at the faculty club at Stanford before our seminar. And I started, see, what happened is I felt like that the conversation about Gerard's work was happening at such a sort of academic level. And I felt like everybody needed to know about it. So I started writing a book, which later became Violence Unveiled. And so at one point, we were having lunch at the faculty club. And I said to him, you've been somewhat ostracized by the academicians because you've been labeled as a Christian apologist. And I said, this book I'm writing, I'm afraid it's just going to confirm that feeling. So I meant to write it to be of some use to you, but it's just going to confirm everything thinking. And he leaned across the table to me and he said, "Let's burn our boats on the beach." So that was the kind of guy he was. And he was a father figure to me. My father was killed in the war, World War II, just 2 months before I was born. So I didn't have a father, and I adopted him, and he adopted me. So now, don't get me wrong, Renee had a lot of friends and a lot of students that he was close to. I'm not trying to say that I was some special person, but I do think that we could talk about this too, because Renee was perfectly open about his Catholic faith, but he didn't. He tried to justify his work on the basis of his anthropological studies. He didn't want to. He didn't want to leave the impression that he was trying to just impose a Christian interpretation on what he was doing. He said, no, the anthropology convinces by itself. You don't have to appeal. But once you know the anthropology, all the changes drop into place in terms of the gospel and the whole Bible, Old and New Testament. So he was. So I don't know how I got off on that, but what I wanted to say is most of the conversations. Well, I'll tell you. Remind me to come back to most of the conversation.
Yeah.
We were in one of these seminars one time, and for some reason, one of the members, who was a very active member in this seminar, was Bob Hamilton Kelly, who was a wonderful guy, who was the dean of the chapel at Stanford for a number of years. And he was a devout Girardian, and he was very outspoken and he loved intellectual fights and so on. And we were in the seminar one day, and Bob said, and Bob was a Protestant, and Bob said, "You know what I think? I think Rene Girard is fundamentally a Protestant thinker." And so then everybody started, well, yeah, well, here's why. And well, there's this, maybe not, because, there's a lot of, and Renee's just sitting there. He didn't say anything. This conversation going back and forth. Is he a Protestant thinker or a Catholic thinker? And in a few minutes, Renee said, well, it makes me think about Cezanne, painter. He said, there's a story about Cezanne, and somebody asked him what he believed. And Cezanne said, you see the maid in the kitchen? I believe what she believes, and she believes the Pope. In other words, his faith was immensely enriched by his scholarship, but at heart it was a simple faith.
Yeah.
And what I wanted to get into before I got into all that is that I think I'm not privy to Renee's other conversations, but I have a strong impression that he and I talked about the religious dimension of not only of his work, but our personal faith in ways that very few, if any, other of the people that were drawn to his work did, probably for two reasons. One is he loved me, I loved him. Two is I was not an academic, and he was so happy that I was not an academic. he said, reason your work is important is because you're not a part of the club. And so on both of those scores, he and I spoke openly about the Catholicity of our faith and one thing or another. And I don't think that was true in other situations, certainly not in very many. So that was a unique something that we shared. Maybe I'm overreading it, but that's the impression I have. So there was a closeness there.
Yeah. And he passed away in 2015.
Yes.
And then right after, I remember there was that horrible massacre in France, and
Oh yeah, yeah.
And that was, and
well,
go ahead.
Well, every day you read or see something that you realize can be better understood if you understand the anthropology of it.
Yeah, I say, I mean, this sounds a little silly, but I'd say, man, it's almost as if when Rene Girard passed away, God, to play a trick on all of us, he said, I'm going to let Renee write the script for the next few dramas here just to kind of mess with people to help you guys understand what he's trying to say about the word of God here, because you need some extra more on the nose narratives here. You got this pandemic and the storming of the temple and all these different narratives going on. It's straight out of a book that, if Gerard was to write a play, this is what it would look like.
Well, once this is the thing, what you think is, oh, now all these things are happening. They've always been happening. Right. It's just once you decode it and you recognize this pattern, then you see it, and it repeats and repeats and repeats.
I mean, there's so many things that I wish I could see his comments on. Like, for example, he always talked about the apocalyptic time in which when the Bible references the merging of nature and man and all, the beastly kind of undifferentiation. And I think about the pandemic where people were talking about, did this come from a lab? Was it a chimera? Was it something from the nature? And you think about, well, that kind of goes back to what he said when Christianity kind of desacralized nature, desacralized the forest, right? And all of a sudden we've gotten to this point where man is hubristically trying to do these gain of function experimentations that can have global impact. I mean, this is totally out of his framework,
Well, there's so much to say there. One is we're resacralizing nature today.
Right.
The planet, Gaia, all this, we're sacrificing. I mean, people in Europe are going to they'll freeze to death this winter.
Right.
Because we worship the earth.
Yeah.
In some way that makes no sense, even in hard, numerical terms, what we're doing. But not only that, you speak of the apocalyptic situation, transhumanism, these things that where humanity, the arrogance and hubris of humanity is, it no longer is under the yoke that will set you free,
right,
of the biblical revelation. And without that, we don't, the yoke that we have is the yoke of freedom, real freedom. But the paradox is lost on people. So they want to be free to do anything, and pretty soon they're creating an objectively apocalyptic situation. By the way, speaking of which, it occurs to me, there was a Protestant writer who Oscar Kuhlman, who made a very interesting point about the biblical revelation. And he said, in a war, there is the decisive battle, but that's not the end of the war. But that's the battle that decides the war.
Right.
War goes on in a number of battles, until it's finished. But when the end of the war is already set in stone, these other battles. So there's the decisive battle, D-Day. And then he said, at the end, when it's over, it's V-Day, Victory Day.
Right.
He said, Christ fought the decisive battle on Golgotha. And in the fullness of time, the accomplishment, the victory, will be made manifest. And Renee probably would have agreed with that in principle. But he didn't assume, even though the problem with the decisive battle is decisive because from that moment on, everybody has to make a decision. And here is where I mix Gerard's work, and he would approve because he liked these same theologians. But I mix his work with a group of theologians that are usually referred to as the communio theologians. Ratzinger, Joseph Ratzinger, Hans-Urs von Balthasar, and Henri Dulebach.
Mm-hmm.
And von Balthasar, his most lapidary of the many, many, many lapidary things he had to say was that after Christ, history consists of the mutual intensification of the yes and the no to Christ. The mutual intensification of the yes and the no to Christ. In other words, so you get the picture. Now, Renee would have assented to that. But he doesn't assume that because there was a D-Day, there is automatically going to be a complete victory. He realizes that this mutual intensification of yes and no was the mutual intensification of the no just as much as it was of the yes. And that the outcome could be apocalyptic,
right,
in the literal sense. That if humanity, once exposed, if you've never been exposed to the gospel, you have a kind of childlike immunity. You've never been confronted with it. It hasn't deconstructed the old impulses, which can now continue on without conjuring up any moral misgivings and so
that's
on.
what Paul talks about when he says that God looked past their ignorance in the past, right? Yeah.
There you go.
Mm-hmm.
So, but once you've been exposed to it, and the question is, what constitutes what qualifies as significant exposure? But I would argue that even if your exposure is only cultural, if you may believe in Christianity in some attenuated way, or you may not, but you live in a culture that up until the last few decades has pulsated with biblical understanding. And so to live in that culture, you inhale it, just as children in grammar school today that are going to drag queen story hours,
right,
are inhaling that kind of pagan madness. So if you have taken in Christianity in that kind of general way, you're still marked by it. It's still part of you. And if you try after that, and it's especially if you've been significantly marked by it, if you try to walk away from it, eventually there'll be hell to pay, because where you go to get immunity to it is something terrible. And so Rene was an apocalyptic thinker. He wanted, I mean, I think you could almost say the driving force in his later years was he wanted, without raising his voice or going into histrionics, he wanted to tell people that an apocalyptic disaster of virtually worldwide consequences was a possibility, and it's a possibility to the extent that we fail to recognize what got revealed in the biblical tradition, Old and New Testament. What was revealed there was the truth that pagan antiquity had suppressed. And the truth, as to make it very, very simple, the truth was the innocence of the victim, who is the accused of all observers. In other words, the one who is unanimously thought guilty is almost certainly innocent, because the power of unanimity is such that it erases moral misgivings to the contrary. So the mimetic power of a crowd. Now, here's maybe the best way to explain that. In Luke's gospel, I think it's chapter 23, you have Jesus is crucified and he dies. And as soon as he dies, the centurion says, "This was an innocent man."
Right.
And this was a crowd that had come to watch the spectacle. And it's even clear in Luke's text. But suddenly there's a man there who, if you look down from the helicopter in that scene, you say, okay, who is the last person that's going to recognize the truth? And you would have said the centurion.
Yeah.
He was a hired thug whose business was to crucify people. It was just another day at the office for him. He was not some soft-hearted guy who might, no, he was the hardest-hearted guy there. And the second Jesus died, he said, "This is an innocent man." That's unbelievable. And then in Luke's story, he says, all the people who had gathered for the spectacle, and this Greek word, it's like 16 or 20 letters long. I couldn't possibly pronounce it. But the Greek word means those who had come to see the spectacle. In other words, those who were drawn there, the way people are drawn to the Roman Colosseum to watch somebody get killed. They were drawn there like people who are drawn to a lynching. They weren't, just bystanders. It was that event that drew them there. And it's that event which is the gravitational power of the old order. And so as long as that power works, we're trapped. But as soon as it stops working, we have to take responsibility for a whole lot of things we wouldn't have had to deal with before. So the centurion says, just boom, right off. This is an innocent man. Then it says, all those who had gathered there to see the spectacle, like the Roman Colosseum, beat their breasts and turned around and went home. This is the moment when the old order just blew apart.
Yeah.
Suddenly, this is how the ancient world created their gods. This gets complicated. I'm dumping all this stuff at once. But the old order,
that's good.
The old order created gods by taking all the aggregate animosity of the community, because we humans are constantly generating friction and mimetic conflict and so on. So you get people, one person's anger of somebody else, and some anger. There's all this friction going on in the community, and it builds and builds and builds until there has to be a release. And just at the right time, somebody is plausibly accused of something heinous. I go from sidebar to sidebar. Here's my sidebar. If in the 19th century in the South, I grew up in, if in the 19th century in the South, if a black man was hung for stealing a horse, the fact that he actually stole the horse does not rob him of his innocence.
Right.
He was innocent to the extent that his death was the opportunity for the whole community to feel righteous, and therefore to have no need for contrition whatsoever. In other words, they offloaded their sins onto this one man and went home thinking, we just conquered evil, even though they had just stepped into it. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That's how the ancient world built their gods. The gods were it's too complicated to get into now. But when Christ dies and it shatters, it's like he stuck a stick into the spokes of the God-making mechanism.
Right.
And humans, and of course it's taken 2,000 years to get even this far, but the old order was finished. And then it says the crowd that had come to watch the spectacle, eager for it, beat their breasts and turned around and went home. It didn't work anymore.
Wow.
So this is what, now, Renee didn't start with that. Renee started by doing research into anthropology. And over and over and over again, he would see that the slain figure became the god.
Yeah.
And that was strange because it kind of echoed the gospel. You know, the guy who died turns out to be the God, the Son of God. And, you know, how does this work? And then Renee noticed the absolute uniformity of the two scenarios and the absolute radical difference in their outcomes. And he realized that the biblical revelation, not just it decisive at the cross, it becomes, you know, the mutual intensification of the yes and no to Christ after that. But the whole biblical tradition, Renee did some marvelous Old Testament work on various texts in the Old Testament that, you know, that prefigure what happens in the gospel.
One time I was in Charleston, and on a trip, and I was reading the Bible, and I come across this passage about, you know, when Jesus is going into the city of Jerusalem, and he, you know, the people tell him, you know, the leaders tell him, tell your followers to be quiet, stop let them say that you're the hero, you're the Messiah, you're the chosen one. Because they were singing these prophets, like those were they were singing, they were quoting the prophets like Bob Dylan. Oh, here he comes, he's coming to save the day. They said, tell those guys to be quiet. And he says, when they are silent, the stones will cry out. And, when I was in Sunday school, you think of that as like, Jesus basically saying, I can make the stones open their mouths and sing. I'm like Hercules, a traditional kind of view of gods. And yet, and I followed the footnote of where that passage went. It went to Habakkuk chapter 2, right? And this prophet is talking about, woe to you who founds a city on bloodshed. The stones cry out for justice. And I said, oh my goodness. And that's immurement. That's the process he's referring to. In my opinion, I saw that he's referring to the hidden victims that were laid at the cornerstone burial ceremonies that had been in the past of his own people at times when they had dabbled in that. I thought, wow. That is so electric,
Oh yeah, oh yeah. No, the pile of stones. This is in pagan world as well as in Old Testament. The victim is when somebody's stoned to death.
Yeah,
the body is under the pile of stones, and then that pile of stones becomes the place where the sacred is experienced. So, so the pile of stones becomes the altar for reenacting the event that occurred there that brought them peace. And so and the ritual, the pagan rituals were a reenactment of the violence. That's why pagan rituals were always sacrificial.
Right.
Somebody, some animal or some person has to die because a sudden violent death has cathartic power for us.
Yeah, I mean, if you watch it happen, I mean, it gets your heart rate going. It's a very electric experience to see violence, and especially a killing of an animal or something. If you watch that on a farm, if you've never seen that before, to be in front of that is a very intense experience. And that's just a little shadow of what that would have been like, I imagine, right?
See, in the ancient world, they were not stupid, and they realized that once that unanimity has been created, and there's a kind of sacred place where it's remembered, then what you want to do is you want to minimize first of all, you want to reenact it periodically as a kind of purgative to cleanse the community of its animosity. So you can, but if what you're using is an animal victim, then you must intensify the attention so that it becomes powerful enough to have its curative effects on people.
That's why Cain's sacrifice didn't take, right? It wasn't chopping up a turnip is not very satisfying.
Exactly. And so it required, the perpetuation of that system required that a priesthood become adept at intensifying. In other words, they had to become liturgically sophisticated,
right,
in order to use the ritual service to create enough attention and empathy. Empathy is probably not the right word there, but towards this animal, so that when it's slain, it relieves so here's another. I'm just going to go one from another. If you go to this is a contemporary version of what these ancient rituals were like. And when I tell this story, I I'm not a moviegoer, so I'm using movies that nobody knows about anymore. But if you go to a movie like Private Ryan and or the others that have that's really intense, the movie's over and the credits start to roll and nobody leaves their seat. And then gradually people begin to get up and move around and walk out. And when you walk out, there are a couple people to your right or left. And if you pause to think about it, you would realize that you feel close to these people because you just had the same experience.
Yeah.
And it was a moving experience.
Yeah.
That's how pagan rituals worked. It required a priesthood with some liturgical ingenuity if they were using a.
So they were feeling bonded to the animal as if they had a deep empathy for their being killed. Is that right?
Being bonded to each other because they were having the same experience. They understood in whatever way that the animal had to die.
So did they see it? Did the priests help the audience, the crowd, see the animal as ugly and disreputable like the scapegoat, or did he try to bring empathy to the animal so you felt like he was really taking one for the team and you really felt solidarity for the animal's suffering?
It works in both cases,
right?
Because if you think, I mean, when you have an animal, you can imagine it's actually a demon in disguise,
right?
But if it's a demon in disguise and it's killed, you feel this sort of virtuousness. We just killed
right.
the creature, and we're bonded because we did that together. Or if it's empathetic, you feel the way you would coming out of Private Ryan. You think we all just shared in this very profound. We don't quite know what happened, but we all feel.
I remember what that was like when I saw Passion of the Christ with my grandmother in the movie theater. Man, that was a powerful experience.
There you go.
Everybody, exactly. It was like weeping. Everybody was crying, Yeah.
Exactly. I should have used that. But that's just an example of how the ancient world was. And you see it on Luke's gospel when the centurion suddenly he says, this is an innocent man. And the next thing you know, the people that had gathered as though it were the Roman Colosseum went home beating their breast.
Yeah.
They're confused. They feel somehow they didn't offload their own sinfulness onto some culprit. It didn't work. So they just dispersed. And that dispersal is it means that you have lingering moral issues.
I to use the movie theater analogy, I've used the illustration of you're seeing your favorite action movie like Star Wars, and just when the good guy is about to defeat the villain, some prankster turns on all the lights in the theater and you snap out of your suspension of disbelief. You say, what?
Yeah.
I didn't get to get the catharsis of seeing that villain drop down the shaft. I mean, you just woke me up from my dream. That's kind of what the Gospels do, don't they, to a culture?
Exactly right. Suddenly throw the light switch on. And that's what happened to the centurion and to the people gathered there.
That's what the woke culture, they think that they're experiencing that, right? So their idea is we're turning on the light switch. We're revealing the hidden mechanisms of oppression in society. That it's almost like a counter gospel mimetic revelatory movement, right? They've kind of intuitively picked up on the same thing Gerard says the Gospels reveal to us, doesn't it?
Yeah, what they're really turning on is a multicolored strobe light.
Yeah,
which confuses everything. Which just is the next step. there's a great poem. I always think of it. The dream, the interpretation of the dream is only the next phase of it.
Right.
So the idea that these woke people are throwing a big light on something, in fact, it couldn't be more the opposite of that. It's a lot of garish, flickering strobe light madness that is sufficiently fascinating for some to make people think something's actually happening. The only thing that's happening is people are being dragged down into a very dark place.
Yeah. And that's what we're in danger of unraveling in this apocalyptic moment that you've alluded to, and that the Bible is seemingly pointing us in this direction, that this is what's going to happen. Does that mean here? There's so many places I want to go with this. I keep having all these questions that pop up, but I does that mean in some sense that the gospel is kind of a curse if a society encounters it and refuses to do what it asks them to do? It's a stumbling block, right? I mean, you can't get out of it.
Well, in a way, I mean, that's to go back to von Balthasar, there is no better, in my opinion, no more important statement than von Balthasar saying that history after Christ consists of the mutual intensification of the yes and the no to Christ.
Right.
And so we Christians, our responsibility is to make sure that our yes is as compelling as the no. The no will have its own compelling features because we humans are so obstreperous and vain and selfish and willful. So anytime you can say no, well, there's energy there, you know. So that, but the yes is a yes which involves one's own contrition, one's own recognizing one's own sin, not just in the past but in the present. A sense of contrition for that, but the recognition that any lucidity that we have about our own moral situation or that of the world we live in is due to the revelation, the biblical revelation from start to finish. So we just have this is we in this. I think I'm speaking as Renee would speak. We have to find a way to charitably inform ourselves and our religious brethren and others, Judeo-Christian brethren, and beyond that, the world. We have to find a way that's wincing enough and appealing enough without having to sugarcoat any of it, so that they will join us in saying yes to it in whatever way they can.
Right.
At least we can talk them out of saying no to it, because saying no to it is a recipe for the apocalypse.
Yeah, and it seems like every moment that we say no is built on us not completing our yes in the past. You know, like in the sense that, like everything, like we go back to the woke stuff and the breakdown of meritocracy, the breakdown of congeniality, and the breakdown of having a solidarity based community where people have a high trust. Right? There's high trust in our culture that you can trust your neighbor to take care of you in a time of need. All of that starts to disintegrate, but a lot of it, in my opinion, seems to be the devil uses so-called, the traditionalists and the Christians of in the past who didn't quite get their yes right, and they made a no choice, like the folks who were doing a lynching, right?
Yes.
When you make a choice towards no to Christ and you lynch someone, and then on Sunday you're back at church, you might do your confession, you might do whatever, but you still made it a dramatic no in a way that's very, very devastating for a culture. And does it not build into what we have today? Is it not that the devil uses the failings of the church to create this kind of mutated perversion of the church to fight it? A mimetic double?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. A point I would make is that a emphatic no can lead to a conversion in ways that are hard to account. In other words, you and I may say no in some little mumbling way 3 or 4 times a day.
Yeah.
But somebody that comes along and commits a terrible crime, St. Paul.
Right.
St. Paul, he was out there rounding up the Christians and, disposing of them as best he could. And then when he had his conversion, he asked this question: should I sin so that grace may abound?
Yeah.
In other words, he realized that he was so graphically saying no, and that the revelation, when it came to him, had real religious consequences. So that we should all try to keep our sinfulness at a very low level. Don't get me wrong, because when you start saying no at that level, you're very likely to end up in a nihilistic place. And if Christ himself walked up to you and said, I love you, I want you to be with me for all eternity, you would spit in his face.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
This is one of the problems I dealt with in God's Gamble. Christ's mercifulness is unfathomable. The question is always whether or not we are humble enough to accept it on the terms that it's offered on. In other words, you have to acknowledge all of your sinfulness and realize that you are in need of forgiveness. And if you can't do, if you a lifetime spent self-justifying,
Yeah.
especially if what you're justifying is something quite horrendous. To simplify it, if you die and there's Christ with forgiveness on offer, and you say no thanks, I'd rather serve reign in hell than serve in heaven.
Yeah.
So the question is, are there any people in hell? That's the question swirls around von Balthasar's work. You can't say there aren't, because it's very possible that some people become so nihilistic and embittered that if eternity of happiness was offered to them, they'd turn it down.
But doesn't Jesus say that when he says, look, you can go against me and be forgiven, but if you blaspheme the Holy Spirit,
there you go,
you can't be forgiven. And if you think about what does it mean to blaspheme the Holy Spirit, it would mean to be against the things of love, joy, the fruit of the Spirit, right? That would to hate all of those things. You've got to be at a pretty dark place,
That's right.
So if that's what it takes, how come this has been such is there a stumbling block in the church that's keeping this from being able to catch on faster? So many people have a theological version of Jesus, but they don't have an anthropology of Jesus. And I think that limits our ability to understand some of the actual ways that we can literally imitate him in our life and in our society to make the change that we need in our own lives and be a role model that others will imitate. But there seems to be kind of a break there because, again, everything's theological. There's no anthropological work except for what's been kind of going around with Gerard's work, you know?
Well, I think complex thoughts on that. But I don't think I don't think all Christians need to know about Gerard.
Sure.
A lot of Christians are doing just fine. Gerard's work is of value to people who minimize, if not dismiss, the importance of the biblical revelation. And because I'm speaking at a gathering in a few weeks that deals with the question of atonement, which I dealt with in God's Gamble. And they've asked me to speak on Gerard's theory of atonement. Well, it'd be a very short speech because he didn't have one.
Right.
He accepted all of that. His thing was he was trying to let people know what the price would ultimately be for saying no to the revelation. So that I think there are people who are far better Christians than I am, and they may even be better Christians than you are, who are doing just fine. And if they don't need Gerard, then why? First of all, Gerard's analysis is not simple. It's immensely complicated, or not complicated, but complex. And so, I mean, there are a lot of people. It happened to me. It happened to me when I first came upon Gerard's work. I saw, the basic structure, and I thought, oh, wow, this is it. You just have to stop scapegoating. Well, it's infinitely more significant than that and more complex than that. So to try to introduce people to Gerard who don't need it is probably inadvisable. I mean, if people are intellectually curious and or if they have some kind of Christian faith that is sort of like, it's just one of the things you do on one day a week, they might need it.
Sure.
But there are a lot of very, prayerful, thoughtful, kind Christians who don't need it.
Sure. I just mean in a broader sense of we had a country that's supposedly 70% Christian, and we're on the brink of nuclear annihilation. We've got endless wars. We've got the largest prison population, we've got chaos. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, if even half of those people literally try, and it's not about Gerard getting you there, but I think Gerard helps kind of refine the focus on you have to, because I think it's not so much about mimetic theory itself, but rather I think the idea of bringing a Christian anthropology into the church, period. There may be other works that are beyond mimetic theory that need to be brought in so that when you go to church, it's not, I mean, I understand it. There are different ways of getting it embodied, but if it's all an abstract thing, if it's all precept, all these precepts and a mental assent, there's always going to be kind of a disconnect between the radicalness of what you talked about when I was listening to your exposition about the prophets in the Old Testament, Amos, and the things that they're doing to shake up the culture. I would say it this way: the left tends to be the prophetic voice, but now because they've had their march through the institutions, they're in the priestly position. The traditionalists tend to be more priestly minded. They kind of want to keep things kind of ordered and going along. But now they've been so out of it that they're in the prophetic tradition. They're the ones trying to speak to these priestly prophets of the left and say, hey, you've gone way out of control. This is insane. Come back to Christ. We've got to get that mojo back, so to speak. And there has to be something that can spark that dynamism that the gospel naturally has when you see the anthropological dimension. Because Jesus mentioned that he was the Son of Man more times than he mentioned the Son of God. That seems to be the emphasis we should be having there on that.
Yeah, well, it not in response to what you just said, but what provoked for me, when just to think about the war and conflict between nations and or conflict within a nation between factions and parties and so on and so forth. And I'm just as I'm just as I'm part of that. I have very definite political and geopolitical ideas, and I may be right or wrong, but I didn't arrive at them with a snap of a finger.
Right.
So I do. There are things going on in the world which I think need to be reversed, stopped, and reversed, and so on and so forth. However, I think that our first, to prepare for those combats, we have to empty our hearts of animosity that has not been converted.
Mm.
If the animosity, if you, every yes implies a no, every no implies a yes. So if you say yes to Christ, it means you're saying no to something else. But if you say yes to Christ, mostly because you feel a no towards something else, then you're off on the wrong track.
Right.
So we have to engage in these political contests, which are very real with real consequences. But we have to, as best we can as fallen creatures, we have to not unload into that conflict animosities in ourselves, sinfulness really, that we would like to offload onto somebody else.
Yeah.
We have to try not, those conflicts are real enough in themselves, but we don't want to add fuel to the flames by inflaming them with animosities that should have been treated at home in our hearts, so that if we confront our opponents, we do so with a clear sense that we're not using them to offload our own sinfulness.
Yeah, I think that Rene Girard would be a great help for folks if he were alive today, to help traditional minded folks understand how to deal with and respond to things like the drag queen story time gimmick and these things. I think as an anthropologist, he'd be fascinated by this. He probably, I don't want to speak for him, but I'm sure maybe he'd chuckle a little bit, but also recognize what was going on as a very real consequence of the forces that he was identifying in history, right?
Well, I have no doubt that he would have been, I want to say furious, but he would no doubt have thought that this is so far over the top and crazy. To the fact that it's happening as widely as it is simply a measure of how deracinated and faithless we have become. I mean, it's an unbelievable indictment of American culture over the last 30 years.
Right.
Who could say over the last 300? I mean, it comes on, it's been coming, but the last, you know, it's like it doesn't happen and it happens all at once.
Right.
So I have no doubt that he would be completely disgusted by it, morally disgusted by it, and would see it as a sign of how it's a sign of this mad movement toward complete undifferentiation.
Right.
That's a term that was important to him. There are differentiations, and it in terms of vocations and what people are called to, and so on. And these are all they work to sort of cordon off our mimetic conflict. If I'm in the English department at a university, I can have, you know, different animosities about the other professors that are, you know, they're teaching Shakespeare the wrong way or something. But that's just in a little group. And the fact that somebody over in the mathematics department is dealing with his own, it doesn't, so they don't spread out, so they don't become systemic. Our little conflicts happen within closed, and this is in some way the American system of government, back when it was behaving that way, was broken up into states. And so you resolve these conflicts at the lowest possible level, and you don't let them become systemic, because then you're in a civil war or a world war. So we're always going to be sinners. I mean, no matter how much we try. And so we have to also be appreciative of these structures, these hierarchies, in a way, that create separate units where we can compete with each other and can be healthy.
Yeah.
Companies compete with each other to make a better product. That's fine. It's just that if the differences that allow that to happen disappear, then you have animosity washing over the whole landscape, and it becomes terribly destructive. And that's what the woke stuff is.
Yeah. Well, my theory is that the woke stuff is a symptom of a culture that's been haunted by the cross and is becoming more aware of the ways in which it victimizes and scapegoats, but it doesn't want to let go of the violence. And as long as we don't let go of the collective violence, it kind of spawns these worse and worse forms of undifferentiation. It's like, I call it consecrated chaos. It makes the time of the carnival, which was supposed to precede, it was a sacred time for the sacrifice. It makes it now the normal time. That every day is a carnival, you know, and it's because the society. I mean, you look at the person who's androgynous. That was something that was in the cults of paganism, right? It was the priest was an androgynous person. It was a sign of undifferentiation. Now that said, hey, that's the standard of beauty that children should aspire to be. You know, you should eliminate your gender. It's this carnival. Every day is a carnival, reversal where, you know, if you don't accept it as the normative of how things ought to be every day, then you should be sacrificed, right? As opposed to what it used to be. I think that's what neo-paganism is, right? It's making that which the pagan culture kept in a small period of time the daily norm.
You're absolutely right. And, you know, to stay with the woke culture thing for a minute, the question is, can we tolerate these harmless, and there are hierarchies that are harmful, or systems of differentiation that are harmful. There will almost always be a hierarchical order of things. But the the point is that the people in the different hierarchies, there should be enough justice and enough flexibility to the hierarchy, so that if somebody is born into poverty in the inner city, he or she ought to have the opportunity, if they apply themselves and they have the skill set, they should have the opportunity to go right to the top and to be a senator or a president or a head of a corporation or a, whatever.
Right.
So, but that doesn't mean the hierarchy is a bad thing. It means that the hierarchy allows people in one system, one part of it, to work out their, relationships as best they can with forgiving and, there's always tension. But if you take all the demarcations away, and this is, you would think the last difference to go would be the difference between a man and a woman. I mean, it go back to when I was a young man. I mean, that somebody who's in a male body thinks he's a woman and vice versa. And now, if you question that, you're thought to be a scapegoat.
But it's a mimetic contagion, right? They really believe that they're a different gender, just the same as the crowd believed that they should murder the woman accused of adultery, right? They're in that same state of crowd possession in some sense. I wanted to ask you, kind of going back to some earlier part of the conversation. A friend of mine and I have talked about this before. He's a student of Rene Girard's work and other aspects of mimetic theory that people have fleshed out, like your work. And how is it that different cultures seemingly evolved out of the more brutish forms of human sacrificial cult forms of society at different paces? I mean, you look at you brought up the Hindu culture. He said they weren't doing the level of brutal sacrifices that the Vikings were when they were doing the blood eagle and all that horrible stuff. The Hindu culture had kind of moved into something a little bit more seemingly civilized compared to that. What was going on with that different rate of humans doing more? I mean, obviously, even though they may not have done human sacrifice at that same point, they still maybe had mob murders and things. And how would you, in a taxonomy, first of all, distinguish a spontaneous murder or lynching that would happen in an older society versus a prescriptive liturgical sacrifice? And then again, my first question is, how come different cultures and religions were moving out of that? Was that a sign that eventually humanity would discover this without the gospel? The revelation of the innocence of victims and the need to find peaceful solutions to problems?
I think there are a couple of things. One is the economy of sacrifice. If the more liturgically adept the priesthood is, the less savage the sacrifice needs to be, because the liturgy, if I can call it that, that the priesthood oversees, raises the level of intensity. Raises a ritual to work has to have a cathartic denouement. It has catharsis. Just drains all the animosity out of the people who experience it. It's like walking out of the theater after seeing the Passion of Christ.
Right.
But and so the degree of liturgical ingenuity would probably minimize the amount of sacrificial violence. On the contrary, when a culture becomes embroiled and it builds and builds and builds, it overwhelms what the priesthood can do, and so you have a kind of an event of a lynching or of a pogrom or some kind of genocidal madness. So there is, even in the pagan world, there is the desire in some way, conscious or unconscious, to enhance the liturgy so that the sacrificial victimization can be the least expensive in terms of the loss of life.
Huh.
So I just think that's a natural thing, but it probably has it doesn't move on a gradient the way the biblical tradition moves, because the biblical tradition is opening up this revelation in a very gradual way,
Right.
and leading humanity out of it. But the same pressures are always there. The liturgy, not just in terms of, well, if the liturgy, like the Catholic Mass, always begins with the act of contrition.
Right.
Every Catholic Mass begins with an act of contrition. The first thing you do is now a lot of us mumble it and don't think about it.
Right.
We should think about it, because that's the prerequisite for opening ourselves to the experience of the event itself. So I think in the pagan world, there is a natural desire to take control of the violence, not let it get out of hand. And so liturgically creating the potential for catharsis. But in terms of changing the world, it's the biblical tradition.
So is that the Hindu and other Eastern religious cults of communities around there were not, it's almost like in some sense they were a victim of their own successes and kind of making sacrifice a more well-oiled machine, right? Because they weren't as open to what the gospel was revealing, I guess, when it was first brought to them, as it was for these more, backwoods primitive cultures in the West, right? At the same time, it's spreading. You see what I mean? That the fact that Northern European pagan tribes are being baptized, and is that a function of the way the church spread, or why is it that the gospel didn't take hold in these more ancient societies in the East when it was spread there? It kind of got stamped out relatively.
Well, I don't mean to sound triumphalist or whatever, but we don't have we shouldn't discount the effect that the biblical tradition has had on all these cultures.
But yeah, now today, yeah.
I mean, you realize that in some way, just about virtually every culture, with the exception of very remote tribes in South America or someplace, Christianity has had an impact. So that when, say, for example, Christianity and Hinduism, if there's a place where they kind of come into contact and there's some tension about what is what, until recently, under the current Pope, but what has happened in the past is that because the Judeo-Christian tradition has a more compelling message, to say it simply, when it comes into conflict with another great tradition, that tradition will rummage around in its storehouse and bring out aspects of its own tradition which correspond to what the Judeo-Christian tradition.
Mm-hmm.
So the very presence of the Judeo-Christian tradition will inspire other traditions in contact with it to discover in their own storehouse things that have that same that in a sense answer.
Right.
Let's say if you imagine Christianity saying, we didn't know this, and they run around and run in their storehouse and they come back out and say, no, see, we did. We had this little story nobody paid attention to, it was 300 years ago.
Yeah.
But look at that, we did have it. So the fact that Christianity encounters causes cultures to Christianize themselves.
That's very interesting.
In some way.
Yeah.
Without destroying, without being arrogant and
right.
Overweening and so on and so forth. But it's just in the nature of things.
Right.
So, you get a Gandhi.
Right.
Or whatever. So I think that's.
But what is it about, and that's very interesting, but what is it about like the earlier period? Like if the biblical text is a product of special revelation in which God enters in and starts weaning humanity away from its cultic misunderstanding that it's trapped in, what was the mechanism that allowed the Jains to say, hey, we don't need to sacrifice, we shouldn't sacrifice, because they weren't getting Amos and Jeremiah and Isaiah. Were they having their own versions of them? I don't know enough about the tradition to even know, but what is going on if this is the place where the special revelation is happening in the Judeo-Christian story? What's the mechanism that's putting pressure on the Jains to come up with the idea that we shouldn't sacrifice it?
Well,
is that the universality of God's conscience, of the Logos?
Yeah, probably you could say it's human nature. The cults of the past required in some way the handicapping or the kneecapping or somehow the truncation of our humanity. And in the course of time, people, look for more, they develop the liturgical wherewithal to minimize the violence, and they look for ways to prevent its spread and so on. So I think there's a natural thing that comes out of our natural morality.
Yeah. That would be natural law or something, would you say?
Natural law. Yeah. But the distinction, I think, with the Judeo-Christian tradition is that it's systematic and progressive. You see it from that, Abraham went up the mountain fully expecting to sacrifice his son.
Yeah. And
something happened there. Now, the way the story is told, the angel came, helped, there's caught in the thicket and all that. That's a story about a moment, which is the beginning, and all the texts before that were written after that. That's the text accounting for the fact that the budding tradition, Hebrew tradition, had turned its back on human sacrifice.
Wow.
And it had done so because the God to whom everybody thought they were sacrificing told him not to.
Right.
That's very powerful. That's the beginning of the process that leads to Christ and then to us.
And would it be fair to say that basically much of on the technology progress front, you look at ancient societies, the way they were able to carve these majestic, massive, thousands of, these tons of uh, uh, carved structures and all these ancient places in South America and over there, all these different places you look at, and they always say, what was going on? Was there some kind of sophisticated civilization that we don't know about that's been erased from history? But would it be fair to say that without the gospel bringing personhood as the paramount thing that should be protected, the human person, that technological progress is typically going to go along the lines of helping make war more efficient rather than making the human person more dignified as an individual in terms of innovations that will make the average person's life better? Is that a because I've always looked at how much the gospel has affected technological explosion, but then you also look back before the gospels and you see a lot of technological marvels for the ancient world. And I think, well, what was incentivizing mimetically those advancements? They always seem to be in the service of war, or temples, and the majesty of the place that they're in the service of.
I
Does
don't
that make
really.
sense? My point is that we've had a lot of technological development since the Gospels, but that you've also seen a lot of advanced technology through the older periods of time. And I've always wondered if the Gospel, as Gerard says, we didn't, the famous line, we didn't we stopped burning witches because we created the scientific method. No, we created the scientific method because we stopped burning witches. And my point is, well, we still had science and technology. So what was driving that advancement when we still thought it was okay to burn a witch? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
How do we have time to innovate when we still thought we had to burn a witch to make things work?
Yeah. Well, human ingenuity,
Yeah.
I suppose, is a natural level, but we humans we spend an enormous amount of our energy from ages ago on two things: on altars and temples, and on instruments of war, or more importantly, sometimes the walls around the city that keep the barbarians at bay.
Right.
I was in Croatia a number of years ago and walking around the walls of a little fortified city on the coast, and the walls were 15 feet thick. Wow. All the way around. And this was a little village of not that many people. And I thought to myself, what did it take to build this wall? And then the question is, this is what it took to keep the marauders out.
Yeah.
And this is the world at that time. The world at that time was such a dangerous place that the ingenuity was spent in inventing fortifications and inventing, various kind of weaponry that would help repel the invaders and so on, and building cathedrals and mosques and churches. These are the things that people, gave, huge amounts of their attention and their communal wealth to. This is what was important to them. A, staying safe, and B, being religious in some way. We are religious creatures. This is the other thing about what's going on now. These things that are going on, which seem so crazy to most of us, they're religious cults, because these are people that don't have a religion, so they have developed one. They've created their own religion. It has its own taboos, its own rituals, and we humans are religious creatures, one way or another. And if we're not living in a life-affirming, truth-telling religious tradition that inspires a little contrition and a sense of compassion and love for one another and so on and so forth. If we're not living that, we'll invent another religion, and it won't be nearly as nice.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the ways the universality of human sacrifice. It is, in my opinion, one of the best indirect apologetics for the revelation that is disclosed in the Gospels when you see it in that sense, right? I mean, there's this practice called Hitobashira in Japan, where they would do these human sacrifices for dams and bridges and castles. Yeah. And they were practicing that even in the 1800s, I think, maybe even 1900s, I don't know, early 1900s, they still may have been doing that in some cases to bless the building of a new bridge. And there was something universal about that. And I think that's going back to when I was talking about when Jesus quotes Habakkuk, talking about woe to you who founds a city on bloodshed, right? The stones of the building cry out. These are victims literally inside these stones crying out for justice. And that, when he said that, that was a prophecy, because the next week, the crowd was silent. He said, when they are silent, the stones will cry out. The crowd was silent. And ever since then, the stones, the hidden victims of our societies, are crying out for justice. We're becoming more aware of their voices, right? That literally came to pass.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we're living in it. And that's why our world is rocked by it. And I don't think that Jesus meant for us to have a kind of sink or swim thing where he throws humanity into the wild rivers and says, hey, now you know what you're doing. Oh, don't drown in that knowledge. I don't think he designed it to be this way. I think he really wants us to succeed, and he has given us the tools to succeed. And I'm relatively optimistic in my eschatology. Are you familiar with Bishop N.T. Wright's work? And have you found any interest in that?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Did Rene Girard ever engage his work about the idea of the kingdom of heaven coming to earth rather than,
I don't know if explicitly dealt with that, but he was familiar with him as an exegete.
I always, when I encountered Girard's work, I kind of thought, and I understand the yes and the no, and I agree with that, but I have a general optimistic picture that Jesus is going to save the world in history. And he's got the worst team in the world on the field to play his game out for him. But he's the greatest coach in the world. He'll get that touchdown. He's going to pull off, the Hail Mary and win the game, even with the worst group of players you could ask for, and that's
me and you.
Exactly. That's it's like there's a 90s movie about those little kids that couldn't play football, but somehow they win, and I think of that picture, the biggest goobers you could ask for. And that's what we've got to work with, but he'll figure out a way to make our brokenness turn into an asset, right?
Yeah. The thing is that the yes to the invitation is infinitely more satisfying and enriching and so on. And I guess part of our responsibility, those of us who've been blessed, I mean, I got it on my mother's knee, it was just handed to me.
Right.
And I walked away from it for a few years. So I tell people I'm a cradle Catholic and an adult convert, both. The gift of having faith in Christ and in his church is a tremendous ballast, because we know that there is nothing that can destroy it, and that it will continue to the yes and the no is a real drama. If we knew for certain that the yes is going to win out, then we wouldn't need the book of Apocalypse.
Right.
But I think anybody who's been really touched by the Christian revelation and by Christ himself can't be resigned to the complete destruction of things.
Yeah.
It's the however humble and soft spoken the Christian truth might be, it will always be, if it's presented in its sufficient clarity, it will always be more attractive than its detractors.
Right. And I think there's another good thing to take heart in is the fact that Satan has to continually masquerade as the slain lamb in more creative ways in order to keep his violence going.
That's very good.
That's a foe that's on the run. You know, he's dressing up. He's dressing up as a woman to get away from, from getting shot. You know, this is a foe that's on the run, and he's pretending to be that's why I kind of take heart when I see more and more insane levels of what Gerard called victimism. Because I think that's a sign that if this is your best hand, Satan, it's not a very good hand, because you have to look more and more like Jesus to try to get away with it.
Can Satan cast out Satan? Everything. The question is, how are we offloading our sinfulness?
Mm-hmm.
Are we coming to grips with it, and to the extent that we can, acknowledging it, or are we letting it build up and then spewing it out on others? And it finally comes down to what Renee said all those years ago. Remember, we started talking about that first meeting with him, and the biblical scholar says, "What are we going to do?" And Renee said, "Well, I don't know, but maybe we better begin with personal sanctity."
Right. It starts there. Well, sir, I really appreciate your time. It's been a pleasure getting to talk to you, and I've enjoyed your work, and I really look forward to. I really look forward to getting your audio version, because I have the text version of God's Gamble, but I want to be able to listen to it on the road trips and so forth. So,
all right. Well, I feel like we're brothers here, so I really appreciate your letting me chat with you for a while.
Well, I've enjoyed it, and I'm so glad that I was able to talk to you, because you've been a great impact on my life and many others that I know, and I know our audience. I mean, we call this podcast Things Hidden for a reason, right? It's an honor and respect to the book and also the biblical passage. And I know that there's a lot of folks who are going to really enjoy getting to hear from you and see you today. So thank you.
Thank you, David. I appreciate it.
Hopefully we do it again sometime. Lots of news events to mine from, huh?
Yeah, there you go.
All right. Take care.